Welcome back. Well, the latest scare comes amid growing fears about quality standards in the developing world. In response, as we've heard, President Bush has set up a panel to look at the safety of products imported into the US. The United States and Europe already have stringent laws to protect consumers. These are backed up by a raft of regulatory bodies that investigate and prosecute. Yet, in many countries, this kind of protection simply doesn't exist. Moreover, effective action is often handicapped by corruption and negligence. A spate of toxic syrup contaminations caused mass poisonings in Haiti, Bangladesh, Argentina, Nigeria and India. The Dominican Republic banned 2 brands of Chinese-made toothpaste in May amid contamination fears. Clearly, much work needs to be done. Well, we're rejoined again by our guests in London, Dr. Linda Yu, an expert on Chinese economic policy from Oxford University. In Washington, Julie Valise from the US Consumer Product Safety Commission. And in Geneva, Dr. Jenny Pronchuk, who's a medical officer at the World Health Organization. Dr. Pronchuk, in Geneva, it was only in May this year that many countries across the Americas reported finding dangerous syrups in toothpaste and cough medicines that came from China. As we saw there, President Bush announced a panel to examine regulations of imported goods. But was that too little, too late, do you think, for the developing world?
Well, actually, it's always too late when we know that there are victims. But for example, the trouble of diethyl glycol, it's called a re-emerging epidemic because we know that every year, every 2 or 3 other years, we have epidemics that are detected by a WHO department that deals with emerging issues such as that one. So WHO has a well-established system to detect those epidemics the sooner that it's possible, certainly. Now, with the case, going back to the case of the lead in the paint of the toys, as I said before, we are concerned about that, and we are taking some actions in WHO because we are alerting the developing countries about the early recognition of the problem of lead contamination, not only in paint, but also in glazed ceramics and in other goods that people are using. So that's the way we're trying to give the technical support for the developing countries to be able to recognize what may come as a pollutant and which tools they should use to reinforce the security or the safety measures that should be put in place.
Let's bring back Julie Valise in Washington here. Dr. Jenny Pronchuk was saying there that the WHO alerts the governments of developing countries. But I mean, how does the US work with governments and companies from the developing world to protect consumers there?
The CPSC does have an international notification process and program in place. Not only do we send notification to the foreign manufacturer, the plant, and the foreign government where a potentially hazardous product has been manufactured, but we also do notify countries that may have imported the product or may have sold the product in retail to U.S.-based recalls. The CPSC can only regulate the U.S. marketplace. And so in our numbers, we only include those products that were sold here in the United States. But as you've mentioned in the total number of this latest recall, it's much larger because it's a global recall. We did notify the governments of other countries that have possibly sold this product within their borders.
Okay, let me stay with you for a second, Julie, because, I mean, there have been some success stories. I mean, we've seen in the 1990s US importers of Chinese fireworks, for example, they funded and set up a safety lab in China because Chinese fireworks consistently failed US safety standards. So accidents are now at an all-time low. Is that something which you can work on for the future?
That's absolutely something that is being discussed right now between the CPSC and the Toy Industry Association. The Toy Industry Association is made up of large and small toy manufacturers, and we are encouraging that association to really take a page out of that book with fireworks and put in a third-party pre-market testing in China. We're not asking in U.S. English slang terms to so-called have the fox watching the hen house. It's something much more than that. in having a third-party accredited laboratory test toys before they are exported from China, and that would benefit every country of export that this product would be exported to, because it would be of all products, not just those products bound for the U.S.
Well, let's put that very point to Dr. Linda Yu in London. I mean, do you think multinational companies need to play a much bigger role in enforcing best practices on their Chinese manufacturers? And I mean, how do they do that?
I think that they should. They probably have a lot more clout than they realize in this area, because multinationals have internal quality control standards. And so in order to, they could simply replicate what they have in their plants in developed countries and actually put those in developing countries. They don't, in other words, they can do better than the safety standards of the host country, but often they don't, because they are looking at low-cost producers, and they often say that they meet the standards of the host country. So I think that for multinationals, what they really ought to be concerned about, of course, is their reputation. Once a reputation is tarnished, it's quite difficult to recover, and so cutting costs probably isn't quite enough, to warrant a loss of a reputation, especially for large, well-known companies like Mattel.
Dr. Yu, let me get a final thought from you. How does China recover from a crisis like this? What sort of message does Beijing need to send out to its export markets that its goods are indeed safe for consumers?
I think what Beijing has to do is something which they're not very accustomed to, which is actually to have good public collaboration with international organizations and other governments. In other words, make themselves more transparent, say we need help on this, on regulation reform, this is what we've done, this is what we hope to do. So rather than doing what they've done, which is they've had executions, they've revoked export licenses, that's not really going to be reassuring enough. I think what they have to do is come into the global fold, do what everybody else does in a sense, publicize the standards that they have, the measures that they're taking, the number of resources they're putting into it, and to make sure that any responsibility for their exports are shared with industry monitoring groups, and certainly with other countries with much more developed regulatory regimes like the United States and Europe. If they were to do that, I think they have every chance of safeguarding their own reputation and indeed their economic future.
Julie Valise, a final thought from you. Chinese imports to the US total something like $288 billion last year. That's a massive figure. Are we set to see more stringent safety controls from your organizations to protect consumers?
The CPSC already has very strong and strict safety controls and does a very good job in protecting U.S. consumers. One thing that I do want to point out is the CPSC is actively engaged in conversations with the Chinese government as well as Chinese manufacturing. We have and are doing what the doctor was just talking about, getting China to engage, getting China to understand and to educate. If they are going to be the world's factory, they need to make sure that that factory is living up to the standards set in countries around the world. The CPSC will be holding a summit in early September where Chinese government officials and manufacturers will be in attendance to talk about what they need to do to move into the 21st century and meet 21st century safety standards.
On that point, we have to leave it there. Julie Valise in Washington, Dr. Linda Yu in London, and Dr. Jenny Pronchuk in Geneva. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.